The morning sun shone brightly over Willow Heights, casting its warm glow upon the towering glass structure of Collins Industries. The building stood as a symbol of power and prosperity, its pristine windows reflecting the ambitions of those who entered its doors each day. The reception area was a masterpiece of elegance, marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, plush leather chairs arranged with precision, and a grand chandelier that hung from the ceiling like a crown jewel. Among the suited executives and bustling assistants, a woman stepped through the revolving glass doors, her presence both understated and commanding. She was dressed simply, a beige coat draped gracefully over her shoulders, a cream blouse tucked neatly into tailored trousers, and her hair pulled back in a simple yet elegant style. There were no glittering jewels or flamboyant accessories, just the quiet elegance of someone who moved with purpose. Her name was Victoria Collins, and though many did not know her face, her presence would soon be etched into the memories of those within those walls. Victoria approached the receptionist's desk with a smile that was both warm and patient. The young woman behind the counter, Jenna, glanced up from her computer screen with eyes sharp and scrutinizing. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped rhythmically against the keyboard, her expression one of polite disinterest. "Good morning," Victoria greeted, her voice soft yet steady. "I'm here to see Mr. Collins." Her tone was gentle, each word spoken with a kind of grace that was rarely found in the hustle and bustle of corporate life. Jenna's eyes flickered over Victoria's appearance, no designer handbag, no bold statement jewelry, just simplicity and elegance. She arched an eyebrow, skepticism etched across her face. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice clipped and professional, though a hint of condescension lingered beneath the surface. Victoria smiled politely, unbothered by the receptionist's tone. "No, I don't," she replied calmly, "but I assure you he would want to see me." Her words were delivered with such quiet confidence that Jenna paused, fingers momentarily frozen above the keyboard. But just as quickly, her expression hardened, and she leaned back in her chair with a dismissive smirk. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way," Jenna replied, her voice dripping with finality. "Mr. Collins is a very busy man. If you don't have an appointment, I suggest you schedule one with his secretary. Maybe next month, if you're lucky." The words were delivered with a practiced precision, the kind that comes from years of turning people away. To her, Victoria was just another hopeful, another face in the sea of dreamers who believed they could waltz into Collins Industries and demand attention. Victoria, however, was unflustered, her smile never faltering. "I understand," she said simply, nodding with grace. "I'll wait then." Jenna blinked, momentarily stunned by the woman's composure. Most people, after being turned away so curtly, would have left with their heads bowed in resignation. But not her. She simply moved to one of the plush leather chairs in the waiting area, settling herself with the grace of royalty. It was as though the concept of being denied access did not exist in her world. Jenna's eyes lingered for a moment longer before she picked up the phone, dialing an extension with hurried fingers. Her voice dropped to a whisper, though Victoria could still hear snippets of the conversation. "Yes, she's just sitting there. I don't know, says she wants to see Mr. Collins. No, she doesn't have an appointment. I don't know who she thinks she is." Jenna's eyes darted back to Victoria, who met her gaze with a serene smile that sent a chill of discomfort down her spine. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Executives and assistants hurried past, their eyes flitting towards Victoria with curiosity. Whispers rippled through the room like murmurs carried by the wind. Who was she? Why did she wait with such calm assurance, untouched by the receptionist's dismissal? It wasn't long before the office doors swung open with a flourish, and a woman strutted into the lobby, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her entrance was a performance, each step deliberate, each movement crafted for attention. She was tall and statuesque, her form wrapped in a crimson dress that clung to her curves with the precision of a sculptor's hand. Her hair was a waterfall of waves, cascading over her shoulders in perfect symmetry. Lips painted the shade of ripe cherries curved into a smug smile as she approached the desk. Her name was Rachel Saunders, Edward Collins' personal assistant, though whispers often described her role in more intimate terms. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her its gaze, and she was not one to be denied. Jenna straightened in her seat, her posture stiffening with respect. "Good morning, Miss Saunders," she greeted warmly, her tone dripping with admiration. But Rachel barely acknowledged her, her eyes zeroing in on Victoria, who still sat serenely in the waiting area, legs crossed and hands resting gently in her lap. The whispers of the encounter lingered in the corridors of Collins Industries like the echo of distant thunder. News traveled fast within the sleekly glass walls of the company, each retelling more embellished than the last. Some spoke of the mysterious woman who dared to sit in the lobby without an appointment, her posture regal and unmoved by Rachel Saunders' sharp tongue. Others whispered of the slap that echoed through the marble hall, the way Rachel had strutted back to her office, head held high, as if she had conquered an invading force. Rachel basked in the aftermath, the corner of her lips curling with satisfaction as she recounted the incident to her small circle of admirers in the break room. Her voice dripped with arrogance as she painted herself the heroine of the tale, a gatekeeper protecting the empire from desperate opportunists. Her laughter rang out, high and sharp, cutting through the muted conversations of those around her. Can you believe she just sat there, like she owned the place? Rachel scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder with a flourish. The nerve of some people. I had to put her in her place. I mean, this is Collins Industries, not some charity shelter. Her audience nodded in agreement, eyes wide with anticipation for more of the story. They hung on her every word, the expressions on their faces reflecting awe and admiration. Rachel thrived under their gaze, her chest puffing out just a little more as she continued her dramatic retelling. And when I told her to leave, she just looked at me like I was speaking another language. Can you imagine? I had to slap some sense into her, Rachel said, her hand gesturing with emphasis. Her followers erupted into chuckles, the kind that carried no real joy, but rather the satisfaction of shared pettiness. They didn't question her version of events. In fact, they reveled in it. In their eyes, Rachel was the embodiment of power, sharp, unyielding, unafraid to put anyone in their place. Yet, there were a few lingering glances, eyes that flickered with doubt before quickly looking away. Not everyone believed Rachel's bravado. Some had seen the woman, her grace, her poise. She hadn't looked like someone seeking favor. She had looked like someone who belonged. But in the politics of office hierarchies, loyalty was more powerful than truth, and Rachel held the reins firmly. Back at home, Victoria sat quietly by the window of her study, her gaze fixed upon the city skyline that stretched across the horizon. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each detail vivid and unyielding. The slap, the humiliation, the condescending stares, she had endured it all with the grace of a swan gliding over troubled waters. She touched her cheek absent-mindedly, the sting of Rachel's hand still fresh against her skin. Yet there was no bitterness in her heart, no festering anger that would poison her spirit. Instead, there was a sense of clarity, as if the veil had been lifted, and she could finally see things as they were. Her husband, Edward, called that evening, his voice warm and affectionate, oblivious to the storm that had brewed in his very own building. "I'll be home late, darling," he said smoothly, the sound of shuffling papers and the distant murmur of voices bleeding through the receiver. "Board meetings and all. You know how it is." Victoria smiled gently, her voice steady as she replied, "Of course, dear. I'll see you when you get home." She did not mention the incident, did not breathe a word of Rachel's arrogance or the humiliation she endured. For Victoria, timing was everything. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1 whispered softly in her mind, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven." She believed in that wholeheartedly, knowing that when the time came, the truth would reveal itself. Rachel, meanwhile, paraded through the halls of Collins Industries with renewed confidence. Her heels clicked with a sense of purpose, her stride purposeful and unyielding. She relished in the power she wielded, each glance from her coworkers a testament to her influence. But there was an undercurrent of whispers that she chose to ignore, quiet murmurs about the woman she had dismissed, the one who had sat so calmly, unflinching even in the face of Rachel's wrath. Some speculated she was an investor, others a woman scorned, but none could quite place her. Rachel dismissed the rumors with a wave of her hand, brushing them aside like cobwebs in a forgotten corner. To her, the woman was nobody, an inconvenience swiftly dealt with. Yet Jenna, the receptionist, found herself lingering on the memory of the woman's serene smile. It had been unsettling, the way she had accepted Rachel's cruelty with such composure. There had been no pleading, no desperation, just quiet resolve. Jenna shivered at the thought, shaking her head as she tried to focus on her work. But the image of Victoria's eyes, calm and unyielding, stayed with her, haunting the edges of her thoughts. Victoria's decision to remain silent was not out of weakness, but of wisdom. Her grandmother had always told her, "The snake that strikes without warning only reveals its position." Proverbs 15 verse 1 echoed in her heart. "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." She would not be goaded into pettiness, would not lower herself to the level of those who thrived on malice and arrogance. Instead, she prepared quietly, meticulously. The days passed with an unsettling calm, the tension simmering beneath the surface like the stillness before a storm. Rachel continued her reign of arrogance, strutting through the office with her head held high, oblivious to the shifting winds. But Victoria knew. She understood that power wielded without grace was a fire that would eventually consume itself. She watched and waited, her faith unwavering, her heart steady. The time would come, it always did. And when it did, the truth would shine brighter than the finest diamonds. It would cut through the lies, unravel the arrogance, and reveal what was hidden beneath the surface. Victoria knew that truth needed no defense, only time, and she was willing to wait as long as it took. The day dawned with a crispness in the air, the kind that whispered promises of change. The city of Willow Heights bustled with its usual rhythm, cars honking in impatient bursts, pedestrians moving with hurried purpose, and the towering glass structure of Collins Industries shimmering under the morning sun. Inside its grand walls, the hum of business carried on uninterrupted, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Victoria Collins stepped out of her black sedan, her heels clicking softly against the marble driveway as she approached the entrance. Today, there was a difference in her stride, a grace intertwined with resolve. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue dress that hugged her frame modestly, paired with a pearl necklace that glimmered with understated elegance. Her hair was swept back in a flawless chignon, revealing the smooth contours of her face. There was no hesitation as she approached the glass doors, her gaze steady and unyielding. To the untrained eye, she appeared every bit the poised businesswoman, refined, composed, and unquestionably dignified. But there was something else that lingered in her eyes that morning, a flicker of fire, a glimpse of the lioness that lay beneath her serene exterior. The receptionist, Jenna, felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized Victoria's familiar face. The woman who had been brushed aside days ago now returned, not with timid reservation, but with a presence that seemed to command the very air around her. Jenna fumbled with the papers on her desk, her eyes wide with surprise. "Good morning, ma'am," she managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's smile was warm but distant, the kind that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," she replied smoothly, her tone polished with grace. "I believe Mr. Collins is expecting me." Her words were simple, delivered with such authority that Jenna did not dare question her. She merely nodded, reaching for the phone with shaking fingers. "Right away, ma'am," she said, her voice cracking slightly. Victoria waited patiently, her posture impeccable, hands clasped gently in front of her. The transformation from the woman who had been dismissed so casually in the lobby to the poised figure before her was striking. It was as though she had shed the cloak of humility for one of regality, her very presence demanding acknowledgement. Jenna watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. It was the kind of presence that could not be learned. It was innate, woven into the very fabric of Victoria's being. When the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, Victoria stepped inside, her back straight and shoulders squared. The ascent to the top floor was smooth, the silence within the elevator almost reverent. Victoria's reflection stared back at her from the polished walls, her gaze steady and unyielding. She adjusted the collar of her dress, smoothing out invisible creases as she prepared herself for the moment ahead. There was a verse her mother used to tell her as a child, Proverbs 31 verse 25. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. It resonated within her now, echoing through her mind like the soft hum of a lullaby. She embraced it, let it settle in her spirit as she watched the numbers climb steadily. When the doors finally opened, she stepped out onto the executive floor, her heels clicking with a measured grace that spoke of confidence. The walls were adorned with modern art, sleek and sharp, much like the minds that roamed its halls. She moved with purpose, her steps unhurried but deliberate, the kind of walk that made people turn and stare, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. The double doors to Edward's office stood tall and imposing, polished mahogany that gleamed under the bright lights. Victoria did not wait for permission to enter. She pushed them open with a gentle but firm hand, stepping inside with the kind of elegance reserved for royalty. Edward sat behind his massive oak desk, his head bent over a flurry of documents, pen scribbling with the precision of a man accustomed to control. He did not look up immediately, too engrossed in his work to notice the soft footsteps that approached. But when he did, his eyes widened with surprise, the pen stilling in his hand. "Victoria?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. She smiled softly, nodding her head in acknowledgement. "Good morning, darling," she replied, her tone serene, as if her presence there was the most natural thing in the world. Edward stood, his chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the polished floors. He moved around the desk, his hands outstretched in greeting. "This is a surprise," he remarked, his eyes scanning her appearance with admiration. "You look stunning." Victoria's smile deepened, but there was a flicker of something else in her gaze, something that hovered just beneath the surface. "I thought I would stop by," she said simply. "I wanted to see you, and perhaps clear up a little misunderstanding that happened a few days ago." Before Edward could respond, the door swung open again, and Rachel Saunders walked in with the kind of authority that bordered on arrogance. Her crimson dress clung to her frame, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she entered, head held high. The room fell silent as her eyes landed on Victoria, her expression faltering for just a fraction of a second before she masked it with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company," Rachel purred, her voice dripping with feigned politeness. Victoria turned to face her, her smile never wavering. "Yes," she replied smoothly, her eyes meeting Rachel's with unflinching calm. "I believe we've met." Rachel's expression stiffened, the corners of her mouth twitching ever so slightly. But she quickly regained her composure, her gaze flickering to Edward for reassurance. "Well, I'm sure you two have much to discuss," Rachel said with a brittle smile. "I'll just step out." Edward waved her off absent-mindedly, his attention fully on his wife. But before Rachel could disappear through the door, Victoria spoke again, her voice carrying a soft lilt of authority. "Actually, I'd like you to stay," she said, her eyes glimmering with unspoken intent. Rachel paused, her back stiffening as she turned slowly. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice brittle with disbelief. Victoria stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Rachel's. "I think it's time we address the events of a few days ago," she said calmly, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "After all, I do believe it concerns both of you." The atmosphere in Edward Collins' office grew thick with tension, the silence stretching between the three figures like a taut wire ready to snap. Victoria stood tall, her posture unyielding, eyes sharp with purpose as she fixed her gaze on Rachel. There was no hesitation in her stance, no flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Rachel, on the other hand, stiffened visibly, her hands clasping together tightly as if the gesture might anchor her to the ground. Edward, caught between confusion and surprise, glanced back and forth between his wife and his assistant, his brow furrowing with every passing second. "What is going on?" he finally asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Victoria's smile was serene, the kind that spoke of unshakable confidence. "I just thought it would be best if we addressed the little misunderstanding that occurred a few days ago," she began, her voice soft yet firm. "I wouldn't want any confusion lingering, especially in a place as prestigious as Collins Industries." Her eyes flicked back to Rachel, who swallowed hard, her composure slipping just slightly. "Wouldn't you agree, Rachel?" Victoria asked, her tone deceptively gentle, like a lioness inviting her prey closer. Rachel's eyes darted nervously towards Edward, searching for support, but his expression was unreadable, his gaze fixed firmly on Victoria. I'm not sure what you're talking about," Rachel stammered, her voice faltering. Victoria raised an eyebrow, her smile never wavering. "Oh, I think you remember," she replied smoothly. "A few days ago, I came here to see my husband, and you decided that I was some sort of intruder." Her words hung in the air like shards of glass, each one sharp and deliberate. Edward's eyes widened fractionally, his gaze snapping to Rachel. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Rachel's mouth opened and closed, her hands twisting together nervously. I didn't know," she stuttered, her cheeks flushing crimson. "I thought she was. I mean, she wasn't dressed like." She trailed off, her voice losing momentum under the weight of Victoria's unblinking stare. Victoria allowed the silence to stretch, her gaze unyielding. "You didn't know," she repeated softly, her voice a whisper of steel. "And because you didn't know, you felt it appropriate to slap me and throw me out of my husband's building?" Rachel's breath hitched, her eyes widening with horror as the reality of Victoria's words settled in the room. Edward's expression hardened, the lines of his face sharpening with barely contained fury. He turned to Rachel, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You slapped my wife?" he asked, each word bitten off with precision. Rachel flinched, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking escape. I didn't know," she repeated helplessly, her hands shaking. "She didn't say. I didn't know she was your wife." Her voice cracked under the weight of her own defense, the confidence she usually wore like armor crumbling away. Victoria watched her with the poise of a queen, her eyes unyielding. "I did try to tell you," she said calmly, her voice as smooth as silk. "But you weren't interested in listening." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She stood there, trapped in the gaze of both Edward and Victoria, her arrogance stripped away layer by layer. Edward stepped forward, his gaze cold and unrelenting. "Do you think I would tolerate that kind of behavior towards anyone in my company, let alone my wife?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Rachel shrank back, her shoulders hunching slightly as if she could somehow disappear under the weight of his words. Victoria took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The sound echoed in the silence, a metronome ticking off the seconds of Rachel's unraveling. "You see, the Bible says in Matthew 7, verse 12, 'Do unto others as you would have them do unto you,'" Victoria quoted, her voice steady and unwavering. "I came here peacefully, with respect, but you met me with aggression and disdain. You chose to judge me by appearances alone, and you dismissed me without a second thought." Rachel's face drained of color, her eyes glistening with the sheen of panic. I didn't know," she repeated for the third time, the words sounding hollow and empty. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "And yet," she continued smoothly, "when you did what you did it with such confidence. I suppose that's what happens when power goes unchecked for too long. But just like Proverbs 16 verse 18 says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Her eyes flickered back to Edward, whose jaw was clenched tight, fists balled at his sides. "I would have let it go," Victoria added, her gaze returning to Rachel. "But I think accountability is important. Don't you?" Rachel could only nod, her throat too tight to speak, her eyes brimming with tears that she fought desperately to contain. The morning light spilled into the grand hall of Collins Industries, illuminating the sleek marble floors and casting long shadows against the towering glass walls. The air was thick with tension, whispers weaving through the corridors like restless spirits. News of Rachel's confrontation with Victoria had spread like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some spoke of Victoria's grace and composure, her unyielding strength in the face of Rachel's arrogance. Others whispered of Edward's fury, his rage simmering just beneath the surface as he discovered the extent of Rachel's disrespect. But beneath the gossip and murmurs lay a palpable sense of anticipation. Something was coming, a reckoning that had been long overdue. Rachel strutted into the office that morning, her head held high, her heels clicking against the polished floors with deliberate sharpness. Her crimson dress clung to her figure like a second skin, her makeup painted on with the precision of an artist. But there was something different about her today, an edge of desperation masked by forced confidence. She moved through the office with exaggerated grace, flashing tight smiles at anyone who dared to meet her gaze. But the whispers followed her, hushed conversations that ceased the moment she drew near, only to resume with renewed vigor once she passed. Jenna watched her from the receptionist's desk, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. The transformation in Rachel was subtle but unmistakable, a brittleness to her smile, a flicker of anxiety that lingered just beneath the surface. Jenna's fingers tapped absently against the desk, her mind replaying the events of the previous day. She had seen the way Victoria had stood tall, unyielding in the face of Rachel's condescension. There had been a grace to her, a quiet strength that spoke of resilience and dignity. Jenna found herself admiring the woman, wondering how she had managed to endure such humiliation with poise. She had heard whispers of who Victoria was, Edward Collins' wife. It was a truth that had sent shockwaves through the office, rippling through conversations and sparking speculation. Rachel, of course, had denied any wrongdoing, painting herself as the victim of misunderstanding. But the evidence was clear, the truth too obvious to ignore. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall, Jenna murmured under her breath, her eyes still fixed on Rachel's retreating form. She wasn't a particularly religious person, but the verse from Proverbs seemed to fit the situation perfectly. It was only a matter of time before the walls Rachel had built with arrogance and entitlement would come crumbling down. Edward's office was a masterpiece of modern design, glass walls that overlooked the bustling cityscape, polished oak furniture that gleamed under the natural light, and abstract art that hung with deliberate precision. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled together as he stared at the email that glowed on his computer screen. His expression was unreadable, eyes fixed with intensity as if the words held secrets that refused to be uncovered. Victoria's revelation had shaken him, unraveling threads of trust and loyalty that he had never thought to question. He had always known Rachel to be sharp, bold, and unapologetic, but he had attributed it to ambition, to the cutthroat nature of business. But slapping his wife? That was a different beast entirely. He rubbed his temples, leaning back in his leather chair as the weight of realization settled heavily on his shoulders. There was a verse his father used to tell him when he was a child, Luke 8, verse 17. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. He had always believed in the power of truth, but he had been blind to the deceit that had been festering right under his nose. Edward straightened in his chair, his gaze hardening with resolve. It was time to act, time to restore the integrity of his company and the dignity of his wife. The meeting was called abruptly, emails sent with the stamp of urgency that rippled through the office like a shockwave. Executives hurried down the polished corridors, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors as they filed into the glass-walled conference room. The tension in the air was thick, whispers darting back and forth as employees speculated on the reason for the sudden assembly. Rachel entered last, her chin held high despite the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She moved to her seat at the long mahogany table, her fingers gripping the edge with white-knuckled intensity. Edward stood at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, eyes sweeping across the room with the gaze of a man accustomed to command. Victoria sat beside him, her posture regal and composed, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. The room fell silent as Edward cleared his throat, his voice resonating with authority. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his gaze settling on Rachel with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "There are matters of conduct that need to be addressed, matters that strike at the very heart of who we are as a company." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rachel's breath hitched, her hands clenching tighter around the table's edge. Edward continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. Respect and integrity are not just ideals, they are the foundation upon which this company was built. Any breach of that trust will not be tolerated. Not now, not ever. He paused, his gaze never wavering from Rachel's paling face. Actions have consequences, he finished, his tone resolute, and those consequences must be faced. The sun hung low in the sky, casting its golden rays through the towering glass walls of Collins Industries, illuminating the pristine marble floors with an ethereal glow. It was the kind of morning that whispered of change, of revelations yet to come. The entire building buzzed with a sense of anticipation, employees whispering in hushed tones, eyes flickering towards the executive wing, where the drama of the previous day had unfolded. Rachel Saunders had not been seen since the impromptu meeting, her usual sharp heels absent from the rhythmic click that often echoed through the hallways. Her office door remained closed, blinds drawn as if the very space itself recoiled from the shame that now clung to her name. There was a stillness that settled over the floor, a tension that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for a release. Victoria Collins stepped through the main entrance that morning with a calmness that belied the storm that had swept through the building the day before. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, her posture regal, her expression serene. Dressed in a tailored ivory suit, she moved with the grace of a queen, unhurried and poised. There was a quiet authority in her presence that commanded respect without demand, a grace that spoke of strength wrapped in gentility. Jenna, the receptionist, watched her approach with wide eyes, her fingers stilling over the keyboard as if the very sight of Victoria had cast a spell over her. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria offered her a gentle smile, the kind that was both warm and dignified. "Good morning, Jenna," she replied smoothly, her voice carrying the softness of silk over steel. There was no malice in her tone, no hint of superiority, only kindness. It was the kind of greeting that disarmed even the harshest of critics, melting away judgment with the simplicity of grace. Jenna straightened in her chair, her cheeks flushing slightly with embarrassment. The rumors had circulated, whispers of who Victoria truly was, the wife of Edward Collins, the woman who had been humiliated and tossed out by Rachel without a shred of dignity. But Victoria's presence defied those whispers, her elegance contradicting the narrative of victimhood that had spread like wildfire. She stood tall and unyielding, a testament to resilience that was unspoken but deeply felt. Jenna's gaze followed Victoria as she moved toward the elevator, her hand reaching out instinctively to press the call button for her. "Thank you," Victoria said, her smile never faltering. Jenna nodded quickly, her fingers trembling slightly as she returned to her desk, her mind racing with thoughts of redemption and grace. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the polished interior lined with mirrors that reflected Victoria's poised stance. She stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the tiles, the doors gliding shut with a whisper of finality. As the elevator ascended, she adjusted the collar of her suit, smoothing out invisible creases with the precision of someone accustomed to perfection. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and composed, eyes steady and unyielding. There was a verse that floated to the surface of her mind, one her mother had often recited during moments of trial, Proverbs 31, verse 25. "She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future." The words resonated within her, a reminder of the power that lay in quiet resilience, in the grace of standing firm when the world tried to shake you. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the silence of the elevator to wrap around her like a cocoon, fortifying her spirit for what was to come. When the doors finally slid open with a soft chime, she stepped out onto the executive floor, her posture unyielding, her gaze focused. The hallway stretched before her, polished floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights, walls adorned with artwork that spoke of affluence and power. Employees moved aside as she passed, their eyes dropping respectfully, whispers flitting between them like ghosts. Victoria moved with purpose, her heels clicking in measured rhythm, each step a testament to her resolve. When she reached Edward's office, She did not wait for permission to enter. Her hand pressed against the polished wood, and the door swung open with a gentle creak. Edward was at his desk, his gaze fixed on a series of documents spread before him. He looked up at the sound of her entrance, his expression softening immediately. "Victoria," he greeted, his voice warm and inviting. She stepped into the room, her heels barely making a sound as she approached his desk. "Good morning, Edward," she replied, her tone even and composed. He stood, moving around the desk to greet her properly, his hands reaching for hers. "I wasn't expecting you," he admitted, his eyes scanning her face for any trace of distress. But Victoria's expression remained serene, her eyes clear and untroubled. "I thought it was time we closed the chapter on recent events," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "There's been enough drama. It's time for resolution." Edward nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I agree," he replied, his tone resolute. He stepped back to his desk, pressing a button on the intercom. "Could you send Rachel in, please?" His voice carried through the speaker with the confidence of command, and Victoria watched him with quiet admiration. Moments later, the door opened, and Rachel stepped inside, her posture stiff, eyes avoiding contact. She wore a muted gray dress, a stark contrast to her usual bold attire. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with tension. Victoria regarded her calmly, her expression free of malice, yet unyielding in its strength. "Rachel," Victoria began, her voice soft but firm, "I believe there is something you wish to say." Rachel's eyes flickered briefly to Edward, searching for guidance, but his gaze was locked firmly on Victoria. Taking a shaky breath, Rachel stepped forward, her eyes trained on the floor. "Mrs. Collins," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry for my behavior. I didn't know who you were. I judged you unfairly, and I behaved horribly." Her voice cracked slightly, her hands twisting nervously. Victoria listened patiently, her gaze unyielding. "And now that you know," Victoria replied gently, "I hope you will understand that true respect is not rooted in titles or appearances, but in decency and grace." Her words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke, soft yet firm, and Rachel nodded slowly, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for Rachel, but for all who had witnessed the unfolding of pride and humility. Proverbs 11 verse 2 whispered softly in Victoria's heart, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom." And in that room, humility had finally found its voice. Us to the end of this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and may God bless you for doing so. Bye.